training. It's adapted from something I used to give to high school seniors to try and make them understand the history of the. Please come in and make yourself at home. To understand the history of the Christian faith, but more than that, kind of the fundamental basis for belief in God to begin with. And so we may start at a place that is so basic that you might think, gosh, I could have presumed that, but I hope we'll end and reinforce some things that will allow you maybe to share your faith with others more easily. I would really love for this to be an interactive time. I know what's coming, and if I think your question fits in better later, I might defer it, if that's okay. So if that's all right with you, let's get going, and we will, like Kyle said, we will send you some of these things later. If you have something to take a note or two, it might be helpful, but if you miss anything, we'll make sure you know how to reach us. So let me, let's see. I'm not sure, Kyle, I'm not going forward here. Oh, I'm not. Thank you for, okay, great. Here's the outline of what we were going to cover. And we've been planning to do this over 6 Wednesday nights and take the July 3rd off, actually, that week. So tonight on the 19th, I want to talk about God. Specifically, is it reasonable to believe in God? And I may not touch my Bible the whole night, which is odd for me. But I would really love to think like you might interact with a complete agnostic or atheist for a little bit tonight and talk about, is it reasonable to believe in God? Of course, I think it is. And many of you do anyway because you come here every Sunday. So I understand that I guess that's preaching to the choir, even though we don't have one. If we did, you guys would make a handsome choir, right? But what I want to make sure that we are able to talk to others that way. The following, next Wednesday night, we'll talk about how God has revealed himself to us. I think that's really important when we're dealing with a supreme being, that we understand that our reason will only carry us so far in thinking through that. So next week we'll talk about the ways that God has revealed and how. Week 3, we'll get into specifically who is Jesus. Who is he historically from external sources? Who is he from what he said about himself, from the reliability of those sources? Week 4 is always a fun one. This is, can I trust the Bible? And we're going to talk to you about, you might have heard some things about how the Bible came into being that aren't really true. We're going to talk a little bit about how that text came into being, how it was written down, how it was passed on. How can we be certain it's reliable? I think that's really an important thing for us to know. The 4th bullet said, what is the Nicene Creed? Really, this is going to focus on church history, but that is one of the most singular events. We're going to talk about how church and Christian doctrine came to be understood as what we would call orthodox. Why is it? Was it just a group of men coming together and saying it's this and not that? Was it politically motivated? Because there's a lot of rumors about that in our culture. There's a lot of people that would want to say some things about that. We want to talk a little bit about that. We'll also talk about more than just the 4th century. We'll talk, if we can, if we've got time, a little bit about church history in general and how we've come to this point, maybe through the Reformation a little bit. And then finally, how do you fit in? How does this relate to Highland Country Fellowship? And we want to kind of steer that church history discussion into our lap that we're running as part of the church history, that we're a part of a church, we're a part of history. So how do I get involved? How does Highland Country Fellowship fit into that? The history, a little bit of Highland Country Fellowship, and we might have Kyle and Sammy join us for a good portion of that one as well. So I hope that makes sense. If you can't be here for any of these, I appreciate that. We're not taking attendance, and your cover charge has been waived. So we're all come to as many of these as you can, and we will be sending these out, and maybe you could plan. It's really okay to bring a friend too, and I'm glad some of you are able and willing to do that, because some of these things are important to talk about. So, questions before we begin? All right, well, let's dig in with our first topic tonight, which is it reasonable to believe in God? This is difficult because I don't know that I could tell you that I can prove certainly that there's a God. I think that would be a fool's errand. I can tell you that one of the things that we learn if you're in a formal logic class is that you can't disprove a negative. It's almost impossible for an atheist to say that there isn't a God and to prove that. And I'd like you to think about that for a minute. If I were to suggest that there are no fish in Lake Texoma, how could you disprove that? Well, you could catch a fish and show me, but without doing it, the only way for me to prove the negative that there are no fish there would be to drain it. And it might be possible to drain even a big lake like that and show you there were no fish in it. But to prove there is no God, there's no lake to drain. So the atheist has a really insurmountable challenge trying to prove that there is no God. But it's difficult for us to try the contrary as well. People suggest that we can't prove there's such a thing as God. That's one of the reasons why the question is it reasonable? You know, I think for reasons known only to God, he doesn't come on the air once a year and do a State of the Universe address. It would be nice if he did, because we would all have that comfort that God for certain existed. For reasons that are important to him, faith in him is required. And I think it is important how that's been established and why God only shows us so much proof is again, something you'll have to ask him about. But I do want to tell you that many of us believe that faith is the definition, like in the movie The Miracle on 34th Street. Did anybody see the Miracle on 34th Street where everybody's familiar with that, I hope. The lawyer, what's the character's name there? I don't remember, but he says to the little girl, Natalie Wood is the little girl, right? And he says to her, I wrote it down, faith is believing in things when common sense tells you not to. And I hate that definition of faith. That's not true at all. That is not at all what the Bible, or I believe that God would want us to think about faith. The Bible describes faith as an extension into realms that you cannot see of things that you can reason with and see. And so that's the way I would prefer to deal in faith. I would rather use the idea that faith is something like, on our way here, I stopped at every red light, most every red light, and I didn't go again until it turned green, because when it turned green, I had faith that the other crazy drivers weren't going to plow into me. You realize that every time you cross a street in one way or another, you're doing so on faith. And you would say, well, but that's different. See, we've observed over countless observations, and there's laws and there's reasons. I don't know for sure that they're going to stop, but I have a reasonable faith that they're going to based upon observation. I think you should hold the same standard to what we're talking about faith in God. I think that's biblical faith. And that's what I'd like to approach tonight. So I'm going to take you through some of the classical arguments for God. I think we have to recall, we're not the first people to ask this question. Can you prove the existence of God? We're several thousand years into written human history, and so people have been doing this for a while. And so part of what we're suggesting is, what have some of the classical philosophical arguments been? You could argue that there's been 5 of them. I'm going to talk to you about 4 of the classical arguments for the existence of God tonight, because each of them has an aspect that will help us to think about. If any one of them resonates with someone you're talking to, congratulations, that's great. But there's an aspect of each of them that I think allows us to have some insight into the type of being we might be looking at. Okay? So let's take a look at the classical arguments for God. The first one is called the cosmological argument. And it's from that word cosmos. And it's the idea that our universe exists and that nothing, it must have been created because something, since the universe exists, is how it's stated, it must have been caused by something beyond itself. I've always stated it that things that are created come into existence because there's a cause for their existence. Our universe, then, if we could prove that it came into existence, it has some cause. And so scientifically now, we can trace it back. I don't know if any of you recognize this. It's really hard to read the inscription on that log. You know what that is? What is it? It is. Congratulations. Kyle, give this lady a cigar. This is Itasca, Minnesota. Lake Itasca. This is the headwaters of the Mississippi River. And on the inscription of that log, it says this: here, 1,475 feet above the ocean, the mighty Mississippi begins to flow on its winding way 2,552 miles to the Gulf of Mexico. And it all starts there. And so part of what we want to do is suggest that if our universe had a beginning, we could trace it back. You could do this with your family tree. You had a beginning. You could trace it back to your mother and father. You can trace them back to their mother and father. You could genealogically, it is possible, although the records are gone, you could trace them all the way back as far as human existence and consciousness goes. You might find some interesting things about yourself. There's these DNA sites now. 23andMe is one that allows you to determine, right, that you're not really a Native American as you thought you were when you tried to get into Harvard, right? I mean, I know that happens to all of us. So, but there are some things that we can do that. So part of this is that we want to trace back the universe, and we could trace it back like it's an explosion. And this would represent something that you probably heard of called the Big Bang. And the idea is that our universe is expanding. And if we were to run the film backwards, it would contract back to a single point. And that was a theory for a long time, that the universe had a finite beginning. And if it had a finite beginning, then the cosmological argument says it had to have a cause, right? Even though it's cosmos, you could think cause, it has to have a cause for the cosmological argument, all right? A really interesting thing happened in my lifetime. I know probably nobody else's lifetime. In 1964, two PhDs that were working on the radio telescope that was owned by Bell Labs were trying to zero it out. Just like you'd zero a scale, right? You try and get everything off it and you set it to zero. They were trying to do this with the really high-tech radio telescope, the two guys named Penzias and Wilson. And they couldn't do it. They were getting some background radiation. So they aimed it at like 19 different places to try and get rid of it. It was always there. They thought it might have been pigeon dung. So this is it looks like a ram's horn on steroids, a metallic thing. They got in there with shovels and cleaned it out, and they were still receiving background noise, and they had no idea what it was. And so they reported it to the scientific community, and some people that not far up the road at MIT said, if there was a Big Bang, there'd be a residual energy signature floating throughout the universe, and it would look like background noise, and that's when it was. And that's in 1964. And so the discussion as to whether the universe had an origin or not was always a theory. And in 1964, it was proven because there's background radiation that takes us all the way back to that. Some people say, are you uncomfortable? Does Big Bang cosmology, is that agree with the Bible? And I happen to think so. I think the heavens declare the glory of the Lord. I don't think there's anything that God has made that does not speak about him. Sometimes we misinterpret it, and sometimes we don't know. And of course, God has the power to do things in compressed time frames, and I don't know. But let's just examine, if we didn't know there was a God, we know there is a universe, and we know now it has a finite beginning. And it appears to us, from the evidence that we can see, taste, and touch, that it's 13.75 billion years old. And that information comes from background radiation, the distance of certain stars and the distance of light that travels and the speed that light travels, rocks, radiocarbon dating, signatures of electrochemical things that we can see and taste around us. So without without touching your Bible, you realize that the first words in it now have been proven correct. In the beginning. Because there was one. And it's proven. And the evidence around the universe proves that there is a beginning. And I think that's fascinating. I think that there's a couple of other things that we've discovered since then. 13 billion years later, this guy named Albert Einstein discovered that space and time were like a fabric woven together. That's one of the major fallouts of the theory of relativity. So that means that this event that occurred 13 billion years ago was out of nothing the creation of time and space and energy and matter. And that has to have some cause. We have never seen anything like that. We don't see that as we're walking around. That's not what we would call a scientifically repeatable event. And so the universe points to a point that something had to have started. Now you might say, well, that doesn't mean that there's a God. No, it doesn't, but it does really tell us that something transcendent, something apart from the universe created it. See, it's not like this was empty space and then God just filled it up like an explosion. Space itself was created. It was nothingness. And all of that is proven by some of these things that we can see. And this is really, really fascinating. Like this fireworks example, if you were to set off a fireworks, one of the things that's so beautiful about them is they go shooting out, right? But they don't last long. You can kind of even stand underneath them and not be in much danger. The fire department shouldn't let you, but you can, And one of the reasons is because they put more of the powder that causes the explosion in there than they have the mass around it. So when that powder goes off, there's more energy exploding outward than there is mass. And so you see a bright explosion, the mass kind of shapes it and allows it to go in a beautiful direction. But when it's all done, it's all just kind of done. Well, what we're seeing over 13 or 14 billion years is a controlled explosion with a finely tuned balance of explosion and mass. Because just think about that for a minute. If you were to watch this explosion in no gravity, you'd see that it explode, and then at some point the mass would pull back together. Because without any other force but gravity, that's what would happen. But you'd have to have a balance. You have too much explosive power, and you don't have a universe. You just have, like what you got here, bang, and it's gone. You got too much mass, and you don't have a big bang. You have like a big burp. Right? It goes out, and then the gravity pulls it back together. And you understand, we're talking about extremely long periods of time here, 13 or 14 billion years. This ratio that we talk about, the energy that creates the outward explosion versus the mass that would allow gravity to pull it back in, has to be just right for us to live in a sustained explosion that's been expanding slowly over 13 billion years. It has to be so finely tuned that it's evidence that it was a mind behind it rather than a random or natural act. It had to be exact in one part in 10 to the 80th. And I want to give you an idea in just a minute of just how small that is, just how finely tuned that is. Because when you understand it, you'll realize, as the character said in the movie Jaws, this was not a boating accident. This didn't just randomly happen. This was designed. So I want to tell you about the first resource that I would recommend to you if you're interested. It's a book called The Creator and the Cosmos. It's written by a guy named Hugh Ross. Hugh Ross is the founder of a website and ministry called Reasons to Believe. What it says is The Creator and the Cosmos, How the Latest Scientific Discoveries of the Century Reveal God, by the author Hugh Ross. If you know somebody that's really into this stuff, this is a great website. It's a great resource. And like I said, I'll be sending you a lot of this information, okay? But Hugh Ross has this quote here saying, "The entity who brought the universe into existence must be a personal being, for only a person can design with anywhere near this degree of precision." Does that make sense to you? In other words, this explosion was so precisely formed, it had to have been the work of someone that intended it to be that way. And let's just take a look at just how accurate that had to be here for a minute. I call this a dime for your thoughts. And this is actually, it's Hugh Ross. He says this, in addressing audiences about the fine-tuning of the... By the way, he's an astrophysicist, so he ought to know. In addressing audiences about the fine-tuning of the cosmic expansion rate, I have used the illustration that adding or subtracting a single dime to the mass of the observable universe would be enough to change and make physical life impossible. So I want you to understand that balance that existed in order to make a universe at that moment of the Big Bang had to be so 1 part in 10 to the 80th, 1 dime in all the mass of the observable universe, and if it's off, you get no life, you get no universe. Now, let me just pause for a minute. Is that right not there enough to make it reasonable to believe that a transcendent causal agent was behind our universe? Let me pause for any questions so far. Are we okay here? This is some pretty technical stuff, but you all right, Danny?
I'm just listening.
Okay. You don't have any questions. Yeah, Jerry.
Not so much questions, just information. I was a young man studying astronomy when I was in junior high. All the theories at the time were equally weighted. Everything theory and other. And Big Bang just happened to be a single influence, was just one of them. That was probably in the early 60s. It was one among many.
Yeah. Jerry, just so that people can hear on the recording, Jerry was saying that when he was studying astronomy in the late 1800s. I'm sorry. This is what you get for asking a question in here. This is how I discourage questions. No, when he was studying astronomy, that there were many theories. There used to be a steady state universe theory, which is the idea that it was constantly expanding and contracting. Very big among, believe it or not, Eastern philosophy, that would be the case. But the background radiation doesn't lend itself to that theory, neither do some of the others. So it's really kind of interesting. Okay, well, let's move on, because that's just one of the arguments for God. It's one that's pretty powerful, though, isn't it? And there's more like it. This next one, to me, is maybe even bigger. This is called the teleological or teleological argument. It's from the Greek word telos, which is, it gets us the idea of design or target that you're seeking, okay? And this argument basically states this, that there is a hierarchy of designs from simple to complex, and there must be a master designer behind all of them. Okay, and so let's talk through that for a minute. So imagine that you're walking on a beach, and you come across a pile of really neatly stacked stones. What do you conclude from that? You have no idea how they got there. Is it more likely that someone placed them in a particular order, or that they just naturally fell and ended up that way? And I think that's part of what we see. And classically, this has been explained as kind of a watchmaker philosophy. I'm sorry, I've got some things to read here, so you'll forgive me. I should have worn my bifocals. A more recent form of the teleological argument originated with the writings of William Paley, 1743 to 1805, a philosopher and a theologian who used the analogy of finding a watch in a field. The person finding it would conclude that it had a watchmaker because of its design, and it was not mere a random occurrence. Right? If you came across something complicated, you assume that something made it, rather than it just naturally occurred. And there are things that we're going to talk about that are observable orders in the universe that there's really no way to explain by what we would consider just random development. And I think this has been one of the most powerful influences on me. Here's another resource. It's called Darwin's Black Box. A PhD in biochemistry from Lehigh University, Michael Behe, wrote this. It's called Darwin's Black Box, The Biochemical Challenge to Evolution. This might be, if you know somebody who's really into science, and they're kind of what we'll call a science skeptic, this is the book to send to them. Because this is all about scientific literature and the challenge in scientific literature to support a random occurrence of certain things here. What Behe's arguing is, at the time Darwin came up with his theory of evolution, a cell was like a black box. It was just, he couldn't see into it. Now we can see into it. We can see the ribosomes, the RNA, the nucleus. We can see how that works and the mechanisms inside of them, to the point where his personal belief is, had Darwin looked through a modern day microscope, he would have dissuaded him from ever coming up with the theory of evolution. And part of Darwin, one of the things he said is, if it could be proved that things could not evolve from a single stage to the next, then my theory would be torn apart. Well, Michael Behe goes through about a dozen examples of things that it's really hard to explain. And I'd like to take you through an example of one of them now that's kind of personal to me. Maybe it's to some of you as well. You recognize what that is? Yeah, Wade. That's a blood clot forming from red hemoglobin cells. In 2011, I had a deep vein thrombosis. I had a blood clot in my thigh. It's not all that uncommon. It was after a gallbladder surgery, and that happened. But did I get a lesson on blood clotting and thrombosis and what goes on in it. This is also one of the things that Michael Behe describes. If you think about this for a minute, it's really good for us as an organism that our blood clots, because it means that we don't bleed to death. But it's also really dangerous for us that our blood clots, because it means that we could get embolisms and die. So how does this system develop little by little? Right? The first organism that developed clotting blood probably died from a blood clot. And the first organism that didn't have some mechanism to stop his blood from bleeding out probably died from its first injury. So you think, okay, but look at this system. Look at the intricate system that exists in the human body. If your blood is clotting, let's see, do I have it? Yeah, it starts up here. And there's an external pathway. That's the cut that issues it. Something from your tissue gets issued into here. And it goes into this system here and this system here. And you combine it. You realize that there's like 17 different enzymes in a stairway that have to combine in all the right proportions for your blood to clot when you're injured, but not otherwise. See, that's the key. There has to be an intelligence behind it. And you look at that system, and you really don't have to ask the question, could that have evolved one step at a time? Because the first organism that develops any one of those steps without the corresponding partner to it, or without all of them in some cases, dies. And Michael Behe goes through many examples like that. Another one that he goes through is something really simple. It's our eyelids. If you think about it, having an eyelid is a pretty good thing. You can understand it protects your eyes. It keeps them watered, right? But the first organisms that developed eyelids would have died of blindness. Because if you have an eye and you develop a fold of skin over it, we call that blindness. Right? So you don't just have to have the fold of skin, you have to have a complicated set of nerves and muscles that control it. A whole bunch of things have to evolve at once, too many for a statistical possibility that it just occurred at random. And this is what Darwin's black box is about. There's a quote I have in here. I don't have it up on the screen, and I'm sorry. It's from a Danish biochemistry professor named Torben Halkier. I love quoting guys named Torben. A system of this kind cannot just be allowed to freewheel. The success of the coagulation process is due to the finely tuned modulation and regulation of all the partial proteolytic digestions that occur. Too little or too much activity would be equally damaging for the organism. Regulation is a central issue in blood coagulation. And if you've ever had when I had my blood clot, they put me on warfarin for a while. Very small doses, and you have to sit in a hospital, which was beautifully air conditioned, by the way, so I loved it, right? But you had to sit in a hospital while they make sure that you're not bleeding out internally, while they get the dosage up to the point where it's therapeutic to dissolve the clot. So they're messing with this extremely carefully. And I'll tell you that injury that I had, which I'm completely over by now, by the way, was 30 minutes of terror and 3 days of boredom sitting in a hospital. But it was a fascinating lesson in the intricacies of the enzymes that are involved in blood coagulation. And you start thinking about that. And I hope this is lost. This could not have just randomly happened. If any single point of it develops without all the other corresponding points, it's not an advantage to any organism. It's a disadvantage. They die. Does that make sense? Any questions here before we go on? Okay, we're doing a good job. I hope you're not afraid to ask questions. Yes, Connie. Yes. They're referring to different processes. This is actually from a medical. In the chart here, the light blue boxes are vitamin K dependent factors sensitive to warfarin, and the blue ovals, the darker blue ovals, are activated factor which is inhibited by heparin, which is another blood compound. Does that make sense? Okay, so he's illustrating really that those two medicines approach the problem from two different solutions. There it is. Wonderful. So this interacts with your daily life. Yeah.
Darwin, I know about the theory of evolution, but when you refer to Darwin's black box and you're comparing this theory to what his was, can you expand on that?
Sure, I will. And the whole idea is, if you're listening, and can we talk about Darwin's theory compared to how he would have observed things like this? What Darwin did was he observed that finches that were native to a particular island adapted when they got trapped on another island. The lengths of their beaks got shorter and their wings got shorter, and they adapted for life there. And over several generations, those that had the specific features that improved their life chances, by natural selection, those genes were carried on. And that's, honestly, I think if you're a botanist or, a zoologist, that's a good theory. That's real science, and we see those kinds of things all the time. But what Darwin didn't realize is the things responsible for those changes are inside of tiny little cells that he could not see. To him, the cell was a black box. That's the title behind Behe's book. And inside the black box are DNA strands and genes that are constantly mixing up to create those variations within the species that can be reinforced. And that mechanism is what could not have been developed on its own. Does that make sense? So it's almost like on a macro level. Some people use the term macro versus microevolution. I don't know if that helps. But on a macro level, of course, we see this all the time. Wolves can be domesticated to be really good household pets, but it takes about 3 generations. Right? So we see that those things happen on a macro level. On a micro level, how do you come up with amino acids? How do you come up with the double helix molecule with all that intelligence by just a random collection of hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen? And you don't. And Darwin never got a chance to see any of that. That's why Behe is not attacking him so much. He's saying this works on a macro level. It worked with finches in the Galapagos, but it doesn't work when I look under a microscope to see these things happening with real cellular biology. Does that answer that?
Yeah.
Great question. Okay.
So Darwin saw the exterior of these species.
Darwin, that's all he could observe. Really, if you think about in the early 1800s, 1820s, 1830s, all you're able to observe, and they did have microscopes, but he could never have seen into a cellular. The question was, Darwin only saw the external changes, what we would consider the variation within species. And if you've ever read his work, which, I've read parts of it, this is not bad science. It's just a man whose information was limited, and it should be updated according to people like Michael Behe. And like I say, I really recommend that book for people that are in your family and in your life that are pretty, what I'll call scientist skeptics. Yeah. Well, about a year and a half ago, we had another event that kind of launches us into the third of our arguments for God. By the way, I guess you understand why that teleology is an argument for God. When we see that level of design behind it, it implies a designer. Someone had to put the molecules together to make these systems, and there's intelligence behind it. There's software that comes written on your machine, and we know that, and so part of that is when we understand that. And I promised I wouldn't quote from the Bible, but when you hear that you are fearfully and wonderfully made, and you see systems like that, you're like, wow. So here we are, thousands of years after that was written down, and it had to have been inspired truth. And that's what I'm saying, is that as the more we look for this, the truth that is around us affirms the truth that has been revealed. Okay, did you watch the eclipse? I think was it September of 17, wasn't it? I think. It was really fun to watch, and we had fairly clear view of it, and places didn't. I remember it. It was a big topic, but it illustrates a really important part of this. And another book I would like to recommend called The Privileged Planet. Because what we're going to talk about next I guess this is really still kind of an argument from design, so we'll leave this in the teleological category. But what we're going to talk about next is the fact that the universe had that 1 part in 10 to the 80th chance of being assembled isn't the only coincidence and hurdle that we had to get over to make this. And when you add all of them up, this astronomer named Guillermo Gonzalez, and it was written by a philosopher named Jay Richards, wrote this book, The Privileged Planet, How Our Place in the Cosmos is Designed for Discovery. And part of what they point out is almost 200 coincidences that had to happen right for life to exist on Earth. And you know, I know some of these from memory, and one of them is that the very first thing that the universe, when it exploded, had to have the right balance of what they call space energy density between matter and energy. And the likelihood of that happening is 1 part in 10 to the 80th. Our planet had to form in just the right type of galaxy at just the right time in that 13 billion years. Too early, and we would have been irradiated like growing up in a microwave oven, right? We had to be at just the right place. Our solar system had to be just the right type of star, and we had to be just the right distance from it. Just the right distance to support liquid water. And we had to have just the right amount of liquid water on our planet. And we had to have a planet that has this, it's like one of those candies that has the outer shell and inside it's really soft. That's what our planet is like. It's molten iron on the inside, and yet it's got a hard, crusty shell that turns around it. And that creates a magnetic field that not every planet has. And that magnetic field protects us from radiation from our sun and from other astrological phenomena. There's a whole lot of things that had to go really right. There's a whole science now called exoplanetary studies where they're looking, and now the telescopes are enough where they can kind of see, sometimes they see a star wobble a little bit, and they think the reason it's wobbling is because a large planet is in orbit around it. And so they're able to then look and identify what they call exoplanets, those that are outside of our 9. And it's really interesting. But even the exoplanetary biologists will tell you the likelihood of finding a planet that could inhabit or host human life is really, really remote because of all the things we'd have to get right. We'd have to have gravity just the right way because the gases we need to breathe, if gravity is too strong, then they come down too close, and the ones that protect us from the radiation don't actually do that. Or if gravity is too weak, then all the oxygen goes away. Right? And so maybe something else might have, some other life might have been supported here according to these theories, but to support human life, a whole bunch of things have to go just right. So I hope that makes sense. These are in support of this thing that there's a design, there's a purpose. Isn't it an interesting coincidence that we're here and this had to happen and this had to happen and this had to happen? But there's one of my favorite examples is this idea of the eclipse. And I've just wondered, have you ever wondered what the odds are? See, the moon is 400 times closer to us than the sun. And the sun is 400 times bigger than the moon. Do you ever wonder what the odds of that are, just naturally at random? Seriously, the moon could be closer to us and smaller, and it would have affected our tidal system the right way according to gravity, or it could have been farther away and larger. But it's just this freak accident quote unquote, that their diameters are the same, but that produces this really neat effect. Well, the point of this is that that's more than just a freak accident. That actually allows us to discover things. I think I've got another picture here. This gives you an idea. This is not, the radiuses from the sun are not correct in this, but the diameters of the relative bodies are. So you can get an idea of just how big the sun is, just how big our earth is, and just how big the moon is compared to each other. If I tried to design something that was that, I'm not sure I could be that accurate. And yet, the placement of these things and their relative size is such that an eclipse occurs. So that actually, and at some times, the sun is totally blocked out by the moon. And you might think, well, so what? Well, what I want to tell you is what that allowed us to discover. What that allowed us to discover. And it was in 1919, during a solar eclipse. Actually, let me leave this up here for a little bit. Einstein had theorized in 1905 about relativity, and in 1909, I think, had come up with a general theory of relativity. And what it predicted was, because space and time are woven together like a fabric, a really massive object would deflect it. And it would deflect it in such a way that light would travel around it. But, we're not talking about just heavy objects like me or Ralph or other people, right? We're talking about really massive. Like planets aren't even massive enough to do this. Our sun was the nearest massive object that might actually deflect light. And according to Einstein's theory, if we could ever see it, light behind the sun would actually be deflected around it and come behind it. And a British astronomer named Sir Arthur Eddington in 1919 said, well, we can see it in a total eclipse. And so what Arthur Eddington did was he looked at the star pattern and he took a picture of it the night before the eclipse, right at the same place it would be 24 hours later. And then he came back and he had a photographic plate that he took during the eclipse. And he said, this will either prove, Einstein, that you are the greatest genius of our time, or that you're nutty as a fruitcake. And Einstein says, okay, that's great. And he scratched out what the angles of deflection would be. And this is a picture of the actual photographic plates that Arthur Eddington took in 1919. You can see that these little double blips there, this was the original position. This is how much it had been bent. That same object had bent around the sun because it was moving around the sun. Isn't that interesting? Maybe it's not to you. Maybe some of you are going, no, it's not at all. Okay, I'm sorry about that. So this is a star right here. Can you see that? That's a star. That's a star. The same star. Everything is shifted in a little bit when it's in front of the sun, because the sun is bending it around. Does that make sense? Yeah, Wade?
Okay, so when you look into a swimming pool and you see something but you're really offset, it's the exact same thing with these two being laid upon each other.
It is, but the point, yes, you're absolutely right. Wade's point is it's like the deflection in a swimming pool. So like if you're spearfishing, you have to learn, I don't know if anybody's ever done that, you have to learn to kind of correct because you're seeing the image of the fish at a different place. I'm sorry. I have no idea if they spearfish in Hawaii. It's a good question. I can tell you some other things they do there. I've learned to cook the pig, Jerry. I've not learned to spearfish. But part of what this proved is that light is actually bending around our sun. This is photographic plate of this, and it's a big deal. I mean, this got Eddington a Nobel Prize even, and he just took the pictures. But he had to go to Australia to do it. And in 1919, I guess that was dangerous. I don't know. It might be still dangerous to go to Australia, if any of you have ever been, so I have no idea. I bet they spearfish there. But here's the point. But by the way, any other questions about that? Do you understand what's happening here? What this is proof of is that light's bending around the heavy object, just like Einstein predicted. How else could we have proved that? How else could we have proved that? Except because if the sun's in front of it, you can't see behind it. But now you can, because the light is actually bending around the sun because of a total eclipse. And what Guillermo Gonzalez and Jay Richards in the Office of the Privileged Planet say is that our planet has been meticulously designed for our life and our existence, but also for our discovery. We are in the catbird seat. Not every planet in the universe gets to discover this fact, and we do. So it's almost like this transcendent causal being, which I may go on a limb and call God, right, has not only given us seats to view the universe, he's given us seats from the owner's box. There's something about where we are. Our planet allows us, where we are, allows us to discover things about stars. We're in the just right, the Goldilocks section of our galaxy, where it's not so crowded that it's always light, believe it or not. And at night we can see, and we can get out and we can actually see stars and clusters of galaxies. So there's a lot of observations that they made that really tend to make them think that not only was there something creative in designing about this universe, but that the designer wants us to know things about the universe and has put us in a great seat for discovery. And the book, again, is Privileged Planet, if that would be of interest to you. Yes, Connie? Yes. So what? Right. And I guess if you want to make a math problem out of it, what are the odds that two random objects in the sky are the same ratio as a distance from us as the ratio of their relative size? I don't know, but it's kind of, whatever those odds are, we beat them, I guess. So it's, was this planned for us? Remember, the title of tonight's thing is it reasonable to believe in God? I don't know that this proves it, but it certainly makes it reasonable, I think. And I think there's more evidence, too. So let me move on for the sake of time here, because I want to make sure that we have time for all of our questions to step through anything. Another argument is the moral argument for God, and this is kind of an important one, too. We'll touch on this later, but this is the idea that there is a universal moral law which requires a universal lawgiver who is absolutely good, since the standard of all good must be completely good. And this is, let's think through this for a minute. It's why is it that we don't steal and murder and covet and lie? And actually people do, but why is it that we realize that we shouldn't do those things? And in the end, what this suggests is that every decision, every choice requires some moral footing in order to make that choice, right? So one way of stating this is that the universal moral law requires someone to actually be behind it. Let me see if I can help with this. If I were to argue, I wrote some of this down to help me. If I were to argue that there is a God, or if let's suppose that I were to argue that there was no God, because the universe seems cruel to me and unjust. There's a bunch of terrible things that happen in it, and no good God would allow it. On what basis am I judging anything to be good or terrible? But you have to have some moral ruler to evaluate whether the universe is just or unjust. And right there, I've evoked a moral law to evaluate the universe and the moral laws within it, because I think they don't live up to mine. And I want you to make sure you understand, what I'm trying to illustrate is not a conundrum. It's the idea that this is circular logic at some point, unless there is some absolute basis for moral law. You really can't make any moral judgments unless there's a basis for moral law. And that is Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. I've tried reading it 3 times. I'm almost through it. It's so long. But one of the quotes from one of the characters there, if there is no God, then everything is permissible. The unthinkable becomes thinkable, the forbidden becomes legal. So the moral law has to exist in some way, and we have to know it, or we believe that it has to exist, and we believe that we know it, because otherwise there's no basis for any moral decision. And how about, let me, before we ask some questions about this, because this one could be hard. What gives the shark, right, the right to eat the seal? Do we ever question that? Is that an immoral thing for the shark? What is, that's a shark, I'm sorry, it looks like he's about to eat a seal, right? So let's put this close to home. If we were on a mission trip to the Amazon River, and we had some doctors with it, we encountered a young boy who's suffering from amoebic dysentery. That could kill him. And so the doctors administer medicines that will kill the parasites. But they're going to kill millions of living things. They're parasites, but they're millions of living things. On what justification can we kill millions of living parasites in order to save one little boy? And what I'm trying to get you to think about here is that every decision carries a moral argument with it at some point, every choice. And we have to, at some point, suggest that there is some footing for that. Otherwise, you never have footing for making any moral choice. It's really troubling. Atheists will argue with this. They have argued with me that I'm trying to suggest that they're not moral. And I know, some of my friends from college are atheists and they live moral lives, but they don't realize that when they make choices, they're observing some form of morality, whether they like it or not. And it was imprinted upon them from somewhere. In the Declaration of Independence, the preamble to it says this: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." One of the things that document recognizes is something that was summarized in a bumper sticker very clearly: no God, no rights. If your rights are simply the collective human recognition of what they are, they could change next month. If they are what a group of tribunal or Congress of men and women decide, they could change next month. The foundation of the Constitution was something they considered to be a self-evident truth. By the way, this isn't something you find in the Bible. These people were more deist than they were Christians. I'm sorry to tell you that. But they fundamentally believed that human rights had to descend from something transcendent. Otherwise, it was useless to assert them. Does that make sense? Questions? Thoughts? Comments? So this is kind of the moral argument that we go through, and that is the idea that there has to be some transcendent moral law for us to make any moral judgment. And we make moral judgments all the time. When we see an old lady getting beaten up by some street thugs, we know that's wrong. And that has to descend from somewhere, and that's an argument for a moral lawgiver. Okay. The last of these classical arguments that I'll talk about is called the ontological argument. It's maybe the most difficult. Let me just read it to you, and then let's see if I can give you an example that clears it up a little bit better. This is an argument from being or existing, ontological. God is something of which nothing greater can be thought. It is greater to exist in reality than in the mind, and therefore God must exist. Otherwise, he would not be the greatest being possible. This is a form of the argument that relies on the premise that existence is a necessary part of perfection. That is too long hair for me, so let me see if I can get you to visualize this the way I did this with my students and the great philosopher Plato. Okay? If you have a pen and paper right now, just real quickly, I'll do this on the back of something just so if you need me to do it. Real quickly, just draw a circle. Okay? If you're not able to draw, you can look at mine. I hope you can see it. All right? Let me ask you a question. Is this a perfect circle? No? Right? How do you know? How do you know? And this is part of what we're suggesting here. Well, compared to what? Have you ever seen a perfect circle? Where? But I can assure you, if we got a microscope, there were flaws in that circle. I mean, even the computers that draw, allegedly, they're pixelated and they're flawed if we blow it up. I'm going to assert that you've never seen a perfect circle, but you could close your eyes right now and imagine a perfect circle. And I think this is the element, the argument from ontology. The suggestion is we know of something more perfect than us, and we shouldn't. We believe in an eternal life. And if evolution was true, that should have been bred out of us a long time ago as silliness. Right? So there are things in us that allow us to imagine. Plato believed that ability to envision created these things called divine substances, divine shapes. And the circle is simply one of them. And he would take his students out and he'd have them draw a circle in the dirt. And there's no way it would be perfect. And he'd ask them to close their eyes and imagine a perfect circle. And the whole exercise that we went through is, how is it? Something is imprinted upon you that allows you to visualize perfection even though you can never achieve it and you've never seen it. Do you agree with that? Okay? That's the best illustration I can give you of the argument from ontology. And what it suggests is there must be some divine implanted in us in order for that to be true. There has to be. And the reason I like that is because that will really help a lot as we develop a Judeo-Christian worldview, that we are children of the King, made in his image, but fallen. Right? That observation seems to make sense then. That we can know there are things that are right and wrong. We can't always live up to them. Okay. Questions? We were going to go till about 8 o'clock. That gives us about 20 minutes for questions if you have any. Or we could finish early and talk a little bit about next week. Yes, Jerry. Now you're an artist too, Jerry. Jerry just said that apparently Rembrandt was asked to make a portrait, and yet the people commissioning it wanted him to audition for it, and he was offended by that, so he drew a perfect circle and walked away. Huh? Well, that sounds like one of the great stories of the Renaissance there. So that's just what one of the Dutch masters would do, right? Well, you never know. Yes, it's Ty. That's a great question, Ty. And just to repeat it for anybody that's listening, Ty asked about what about young Earth, what I'll call young Earth creation models that add up the genealogies in the Bible and suggest that the Earth is 10 to 20,000 years old, as opposed to what I've talked about to now, much of the evidence, which is more of an old Earth creation model. First of all, I want to say that I think Christians wonderful, spirit-filled Christians with whom we will be sharing eternity can differ on this. And I would never make it a test of orthodoxy as to whether somebody believes my view about creation or a different view about creation. The young Earth position takes literally the 7 days, the 6 days of creation, because the 7th one is open. They see that there was a morning, there was an evening, and there was a day, and that those were 24-hour periods. And a monk, sometime, I forget when, added up all the lifespans and genealogies and added factors for the fact that they may have lived longer and came up with an estimate of the age of the earth that was closer to 10,000 years. And that, if somebody believes that, God certainly could have created everything around us and made it appear older than it is. But here's my position on this, Ty, is that you and I both have to wrestle with the fact that it does indeed appear old. God can create things that appear old. He did so in the Garden of Genesis. Right? When Adam was created, I don't think he was created as a baby. Right? I think he was created as a full-grown man. It says that the trees had fruits with seed in them. So I think God can create things that are mature. God might have created the universe around us to appear to be 13.67 or 76 billion years old. And it might be less older than that. And I would never make that a test of orthodoxy. But I have to wrestle with, then, why did he make it appear this old? Because the heavens declare the glory of the Lord. I don't think the heavens appear to declare the glory of the Lord. I think the heavens do declare that. I think there's 20 creation accounts in the Bible, not just in Genesis. And I think when you take them together, I believe that it's the best harmony allows for an older earth. But I am completely respectful of people who read that text and they say, you know what? God said he did it in 6 days. It's a matter of faith for me, and great. You go right ahead, and we're going to march into heaven, and we're both going to be surprised by what we find there. But I want you to know what I believe about it. I'm not trying to influence anyone anyway, but the sticking point for me is, if you believe in a young earth creation and you study the science, then you have a problem that you need to explain. Why did God make it appear older than it is? And some people have addressed that problem. Ken Ham is a pretty famous scientist, and I forget the name of his organization. I'll try and look it up for you. And he is one of the most famous and renowned young earth creations, and he offers some evidence for that. But it still doesn't satisfactorily, at least to my sake, answer that question. Why does the earth appear to be so old? Is God lying to us? Are we being deceived? Or did he just make it and appear old, and I just don't see that, and that's in the scripture somewhere? I hope I haven't started a fight or a controversy with anybody about it, because churches can split over things like this. I'd rather we split over something like Hawaiian shirts, Ty. I really would, because something that's much more theologically important to me. But does that answer your question? Yeah, no, it's a great observation that I don't disrespect those people, but I have yet to meet one and satisfactorily hear why God created a world that appears that old to fool us. I'm stuck on that one. Okay, yes, Captain. I think, Phil, just for the purpose of the recording, Phil is putting forth this idea that at some point, regardless of what theory, there's some place where you run out of answers. And that's, I think that's the point of the cosmological arguments for the existence of God, is that at some point there's a requirement for a transcendent causal agent. There has to be something that exists apart from everything that you think exists to have kicked it into action to begin with. And if you believe that happened 10,000 years ago or 10 billion years ago, or if you think that happened in a different way, you still have to explain the origin of that thing. And that's difficult. So, or at least that's the jumping off point for most people. It's a good observation. And you guys talked about that in your sociology class. Graduate. I think that's some of this is the hubris of human beings wanting to explain everything, and I know that really well. I've lived a lot of that, I'm afraid. I like knowing how things work. I mean, I really do. As an engineer, and I really like knowing how things work. And at some point, it bothered me that I couldn't figure out the mechanism of salvation. I wanted to flow chart it, right? And I know that makes a lot of you laugh, and it should. But I think there are people out there who don't know God that are frustrated because they don't know. They laugh at the idea of an immaculate conception. Really? I mean, come on. A man born of a virgin? But look, at some point, the universe you're living in was an immaculate conception. At some point, it goes back to a causal event that you can't explain. And it reminds me of Captain Barbossa in the Pirates of the Caribbean, You'd best be believing in ghost stories, Missy, because you're in one, You best be believing in an immaculate conception. You're born of one. This universe has no explanation apart from a transcendent causal agent. So I think however far back you go, that's still true. Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And the point is, if you take word by word literal Bible, how do you reconcile the science versus Genesis? Let me just tell you one. I think it's really important to take the Bible as a whole in that regard. Let me just give you an example. The days of creation are spelled out: morning, evening, morning, evening, morning, evening. The sixth day is the day that man was created, right? But the creation of man is spelled out in greater detail in chapter 2. If you read chapter 2, there's no way that happened in one 24-hour day. Adam grew tired of being alone, And there was a case where he would name all these things, and then, Eve was made from a rib, and he says, at long last. Somebody that looks like me and has the Spirit of God in them, and I don't think that happened in a 24-hour period. So part of it is I want to take a consistent view of the 20 that I believe are the creation accounts in the Bible, including in the Psalms when it says the heavens declare the glory of God. If having to give a choice to believe God or believe a scientist, I'll believe God. But I think some of it too is, am I interpreting his word correctly? If there's evidence that this happened and it fits the sequence of things, but it doesn't fit the timing, maybe I've read the timing wrong. So I hope that makes sense. At least for me, and I'm somebody who really likes to take the Bible literally word for word. You know that because that's the way I go through it. The Genesis account is not to me, it's not something to spiritualize, but it is something that there's an allowing there for those days to be much longer periods of time with demarcations. And so I've made my peace with that personally, and I think there's other ways to do that. And there are some difficulties with that, though, to be sure, is harmonizing what we see as evidence versus what's written. Over time, though, I'm convinced that those are my mistakes, not God's. I hope that's a great question and a good observation. Let me go over to this side of the room. Yes, sir. Oh, you and I will never divide over that. And the whole thing is that many of us, I began with a young earth creation position. It says day. What are you going to do about that? It's a day. But it's taken me some time to kind of think through that. It doesn't mean I'm right. And again, it's not anything that divides. Really, the purpose of tonight is it reasonable to believe in God? And I think let's focus on that. But it is a great observation that the evidence that I cite that you don't need your Bible to prove the existence of God would tend to be more from an older earth position. Okay? And there are some things about when the dinosaurs lived and when human beings lived and things like that are, in Job they refer to a couple of beasts that we think might have been dinosaurs, but they might have also been a hippopotamus from the way that we could read the literature. And a hippopotamus would be a scary looking beast anyway, right? So I don't know. I'm not, but I think it's most important that we understand we are not going to divide over that, because the ultimate conclusion is that whether it happened in over millions of years or whether it happened because of the Great Flood, the Grand Canyon is a beauty made by God, right? And so, hang on, Trish, I wanted to come over here. I'll get back to you. Wade is pointing out that a day, sometimes the word nam, let's translate a day, is sometimes used to talk about a smaller part of a day, a 24-hour period, and an age, like the day of the Lord will come, right? Yeah, so, but I guess my point is that gives us license to kind of look at that a little differently, but it's not anything, if you have one view of what that means in Genesis and I have another, we don't have to fight to the death over it, right? If we have, that's the biggest thing. Did you have something, Trish? Yeah, I think Trish's summary is that some of these things don't matter. There's precision and intent behind us and the world we live in. And I think that's independent of how we might read some of those scriptures. Jerry, you had something. I have no idea, Jerry. I'm going to ask him as soon as I get to look him face to face. And right, so the part of this that I think Jerry's point is the same as Trish's. All of these things are in the hands of the transcendent causal agent, and there is proof of that transcendent God. Maybe we should just leave it at that. It is kind of a silly question in one case, because remember now, one of the things that was created at the creation of the universe was time. Can you imagine what a silly question it is to ask how long it took to create time? You're asking how long it took to create something before there was a mechanism to measure it, right? So that's the engineer in me pointing out the problem with that. Where's the stopwatch, But I think sometimes these discussions generate more heat than light, if you take my meaning. that they generate more friction between people than light and illumination of God's word. And so I'm glad that the most important thing tonight that we want to focus on is it reasonable? So do you think, seeing what you've seen, and maybe you knew some of this already, and I know we're preaching to the choir here, but for our first night, do you think it's reasonable to believe in God? And then I think that's the whole purpose. And then next week, we're going to talk about how that God, at least theoretically, how he would have revealed himself to us, and then talk about some of the ways that God did reveal some of that to us. And things like eclipses and things are ways that information might have been revealed to us. I thank you all for coming. I'm going to close in a word of prayer. If you want to stick around, if you got some other questions or you want to talk through some of this, I'll be glad to stick around for a little while. If we don't have your email, because I will be sending you copies of tonight's slides, and I think I'll try and put together, because maybe the biggest thing you might want from this are the resources if you want to read and go further into this. So I'll try and put together a separate list and send it out of some of the great websites and the books that were featured in this so that you can have those too. And we will send that via email. So please don't leave until making sure that we have your correct email. Okay? Is that good? It's a good place to stop, and then we can go get ice cream. Which is another, I could have included that as a proof of God, actually, but I didn't. But, okay, thank you, Father, for making yourself reasonably known to us so that those of us who, by faith, seek you can have confidence that it is reasonable to believe in you. And yet, for some reason, Lord, there are those who still doubt your existence, and we would really love the opportunity to reach them, to talk through them, to give them the confidence to seek you. And as we have come together to learn more about you and more about what it means to be a follower of your Son, Jesus Christ, I ask that you pour out your special blessing on these people who have given of their time to come and learn that you would open their hearts and minds to remember and to apply what we've learned. And I thank you for them in advance. We ask that you protect us now as we leave and gather us together again in a week.